Dear colleagues, we are starting an interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Viktorovich Lavrov to Russian and foreign mass media. And let me give the floor to the first correspondent. This is Russia 24. Please ask a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely. Sergey Viktorovich, I welcome you. Maria Vladimirovna, hello. Of course, probably the most important issue right now is, of course, questions about negotiations. And now there are a lot of voices coming from diplomatic circles, experts, and so on. Well, simply put, we are being measured here very actively, and different versions, and so on. But the question is, with whom to negotiate in Kyiv? Now, again, Mr. Kalik is coming up with initiatives. This is already cut by the new administration. If it is approved, of course. And so on. Sergey Viktorovich, how do you see the situation in this matter? You know, a lot has already been said on this topic. The President has repeatedly addressed this topic, including during a direct line. Before that, at the Valdai Club during other events, we cannot arrange an empty conversation. So far, all we hear is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce, and it is not particularly hidden. That this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping Ukraine with weapons so that they put themselves in order, carry out additional mobilization, and so on. A truce is a path to nowhere. We need final legal agreements that will fix all the conditions for ensuring the security of the Russian Federation and, of course, the interests, legitimate security interests of our neighbors. But in a context that will consolidate the impossibility of violating these agreements in an international legal way. And these agreements should first of all concern the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis, the main of which, or two main of which, are, first of all, the violation of all obligations not to advance NATO to the east and the aggressive absorption by NATO of the entire geopolitical space up to our borders. Ukraine was destined for this fate, and even now they continue to talk about it. And the first reason is absolutely the Russian actions of the Kyiv regime. Russian language, mass media, culture, even the use of the Russian language in everyday life, as well as the ban of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, were officially proclaimed and then legislated upon after the coup d'état. Therefore, when we are told that Russia is putting forward preconditions, these are not preconditions. This is a requirement to fulfill what was previously agreed upon. As it turns out, we were lied to when they assured us that NATO would not move to the east, and when they emphasized their commitment to a settlement based on the UN Charter, but categorically forgetting that in this charter, there is not only confirmation and principles of territorial integrity. There is also the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and the General Assembly for a long time. I have considered the relationship between these principles and decided in my wisdom by consensus that it is necessary to respect the territorial integrity of all states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination, and therefore represent the entire population living on the relevant territory. But how can the Kyiv Nazi regime represent the interests of Crimeans, residents of Donbass, Novorossiya, whom it declared terrorists immediately after the coup d'état and launched a military, so-called anti-terrorist operation against them? The initiatives of China and Brazil on the Ukrainian crisis, they all emphasize the need to respect the UN Charter. The principle of territorial integrity is mentioned in case to case. We are talking with our Chinese, Brazilian friends, and other countries that cooperate in promoting this initiative dictated by the best intentions that the Charter. It is much more multifaceted than just the principle of territorial integrity. The principle of self-determination of peoples is no less important. If it were not for this principle, there would probably be problems with the decolonization of African and other peoples. It was this principle that became the international legal basis for decolonization, and decolonization reflected the unwillingness and inability of African peoples to live under the rule of colonizers. In exactly the same way, the population of Crimea, Donbass, and Novorossiya does not want, cannot, and will never live under the rule of the Nazis who seized power in Kyiv. Therefore, the principle of self-determination of peoples comes into force. They have self-determined. Crimeans in the 2014 year, a couple of years ago, Donbass and Novorossiya. And these are the realities that are reflected in our constitution. Therefore, if we want to speak seriously, we need to treat the principles of the UNCharter not selectively, but in their entirety, and interrelationship. And, of course, not forgetting the principle of respect for human rights, so beloved by the West. This was not invented by the West, it is written in the UNCharter. The very first article of the Charter states that everyone is obliged to respect human rights regardless of gender, race, language, and religion. The Russian language has been legally exterminated in Ukraine. The canonical religion, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, is banned. So I believe that all those who want to sincerely help find the basis for resolving the crisis cannot ignore its root causes. Let me remind you that Chinese President Xi Jinping, in his initiative on global security in February of the 23rd year, which was devoted in general to any conflicts and the principles of their settlement, emphasized in the text of this document the need to see and eliminate the root causes of any conflict in order to resolve it. I would also like to touch upon, you mentioned Mr. Kelleg, who has been announced as the future special representative of President Trump for Ukraine. He recently said here, "We saw an attempt by Russia and Ukraine within the framework of the Minsk process, which failed." Therefore, we will not repeat it, he said. In fact, well, of course, Mr. Kelleg, he has yet to dive deeper into the Ukrainian dossier. But the Minsk agreements were not an attempt, they were signed documents. Documents that were guaranteed by the additional declaration of the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, where it was said that Euro-Atlantic security would be taken into account the interests of all countries, where it was said that efforts to create a single space from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean will be restored.
Где было сказано, что будут восстановлены усилия по созданию единого пространства от Атлантики до Тихого океана.
A lot of things were said there. Nothing that was written down in this declaration, as well as in the Minsk document itself, regarding the duties of the Ukrainian regime, has been fulfilled. But I would like to emphasize once again that this is a document that was agreed upon, signed at the highest level, and approved unanimously in the UN Security Council. Therefore, perhaps Mr. Kelleg needs to look deeper into this. The Minsk agreements were not an attempt, it was a decision of the UN Security Council, which was trampled underfoot with the encouragement of the United States and Poroshenko, who signed it. As the then President of Ukraine, and former German leaders Merkel and Holland. I think all three of them admitted a couple of years ago that they were not going to fulfill these Minsk agreements. It took time to pump Ukraine with weapons. And now all those ideas that are in the air, which are much less binding than the Minsk agreements, also practically pursue the same goal: to buy time for the Nazi regime.
Практически преследует ту же самую цель – выиграть время для нацистского режима.
As President Putin said, we are ready to consider any serious concrete proposals, to speculate, to guess on the coffee grounds. Now is probably premature. I really hope that Mr. Trump's administration, including Mr. Kelleg, will delve into the root causes of the conflict, And we are always ready for consultations, ready. Once again, if someone does not understand our repeatedly and clearly stated position, we are always ready to confirm this position. We are open to any negotiations, if the negotiations are in fact about the root causes and about the principles. That President Putin said in June this year, he speaks here at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and which, I would like to emphasize, are not any preconditions. This is a requirement to fulfill what everyone signed up to when adopting the Charter of the United Nations.
Please, Media Corporation of China.
Maria Vladimirovna, dear Sergey Viktorovich, in a recent interview, you said that it becomes toxic when someone sees that an American or a European is talking to you. And prophets generally run away when they see you. With such a setup of Western politicians, is it even possible to solve any serious international problems at all? Diplomacy, as an instrument of foreign policy, is still active in international life at the moment. And I have a second question about the cooperation of the Global South. And Russia is being led to consolidate the world majority, unite in the style of the Global South. During the BRICS summit in Kazan, our two corporations jointly held a round table with the BRICS mini-countries, at which the participants unanimously sought to create a mechanism for access to appetitive and fair information. And in the coming year, the SCO summit will be held in China, and together we will celebrate the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism. In your opinion, what steps should the countries of the Global South, together with China and Russia, take, including in the field of mass media, to protect the international order after the end of World War II and world peace? Thank you. Thank you. As for the methods that our Western colleagues are currently using in international communication, one can lament a lot, but it's useless because they have made a political decision to isolate Russia in every sense. They put forward some crazy demands on other countries not to meet with Russian representatives, not to receive them, not to go to them. Stop trading, buy more expensive energy carriers at a loss.
Не принимать их, не ездить к ним, перестать торговать, покупать более дорогие энергоносители себе в убыток.
That's what the methods of so-called Western diplomacy are now, which all boils down to threats, sanctions, punishment, and blackmail. By the way, Joseph Borrell, who recently left the post of foreign policy representative of the European Union, said that recently, without being burdened with official duties at all, he said about 10 days ago that the West could not isolate Russia. The European Union has promised to help Kyiv as much as it needs, but nothing is unlimited. And speaking about sanctions, he said bluntly, China has replaced Europe and the Group of Seven in trade and economic relations with Russia. Well, I am sure that he has not seen the light in the last week, and everyone has always understood this, that Western sanctions primarily harm the populations of those countries that apply these sanctions. America even had a hurricane recently, which President Biden did not notice at first, then went there. Do you remember what payments they had? Some payments of $700, in my opinion, dollars per person. And there were huge protests that with such an attitude to their own citizens. Tens, more than $150 billion were sent to Ukraine over the past couple of years. In France, there was also a crop failure, there was an agricultural crisis, and farmers protested. German industry just fell and collapsed. They know better how to behave, but I have a feeling that the Americans are in quality. What kind of policy do they have? Remove competitors. Now they are removing Russia. They are already beginning to remove China. They are already restricting the supply of various chips and microelectronics elements to China, wanting to restrain technological development. The Chinese people, like the Russian people, will still do what we need for our development. But these methods are absolutely clear, and apart from us, apart from China, to a certain extent, even to a large extent, Europe has also become a victim of the course of the United States to eliminate any competitors. Therefore, of course, we see all this, we mean all this, and we are ready, as we have repeatedly stated, to talk with all Western representatives who are determined to have an equal dialogue, search for a balance of interests, and mutually beneficial agreements. And there are such representatives. Hungary, Slovakia, and other EU members are also slowly starting to ask for some kind of confidential conversations. But very few people dare openly. There is such a strict discipline in the European Union. The new head of the European diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, dictates to everyone how they should behave. Let's see how much the Brussels bureaucracy, which everyone is already comparing with a tougher version of the Soviet authoritarian system, will be able to convince the member countries that it knows the mood of their population and the needs of these peoples better than them. As for our relations, we are well aware that Russia and China, this is widely recognized, really represent a stabilizing factor in international relations. And as an example of the positive impact of Beijing and Moscow on the international situation, I will, of course, cite the BRICS cooperation. Within the framework of this association, countries representing different continents, different civilizations, different religions, different cultures cooperate. And all this harmoniously fits into the agreements that are regularly agreed within the framework of BRICS, which cover all spheres of activity without involvement: politics, military political issues, security issues, economics, culture, education, in general, all spheres of human activity. The popularity of BRICS is huge. In Kazan, the summit was attended by delegations of 35 states and 6 multilateral organizations, leaders, including the United Nations. And such representativeness, of course, speaks to the authority of this structure in the growing interest in rapprochement with the BRICS, of other organizations of the Global South and the Global East, which adhere to an independent line in international affairs. And I am convinced that the sustainable development of a multipolar world is simply impossible without establishing interaction between these new type of associations, where there are no leaders and subordinates, where there are no bosses. There are no orders that need to be executed, as we see both in the European Union and in NATO. Therefore, I hope that the multipolar world, of course, involves the participation of our Western colleagues in these processes. And they will not disappear anywhere from our planet, but how they will position themselves, how they will survive, probably. Such a severe psychological loss of dominance, which they enjoyed for half a millennium, it depends on their political culture, on their understanding of their real place in modern life, and on their ability to act in accordance with this real place, while respecting the legitimate interests and legitimate achievements of other states, including the BRICS state. As for the informational aspect of the BRICS work, of course, we proceed from the fact that it is necessary to explain in a good sense the principles on which the BRICS operates, the principles on which its informational work is ensured, because too many rumors and deliberate fakes about the activities of our association are spreading in the West in order to detach the countries of the Global South located on all continents of Africa, Asia and Latin America from the BRICS.
Страны глобального юга, расположенные на всех континентах Африки, Азии и Латинской Америки. И, конечно же,
the promotion of information interaction is very important in order to strengthen the positions of the BRICS and the Global South as a whole in universal structures. These include the United Nations, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and, of course, the Group of 20 and other formats. In all these formats, I emphasize once again, the Russian-Chinese bond plays a very, very important consolidating role for the states of the Global South. You mentioned the upcoming anniversary of the victory in World War II. Our countries, China and Russia, took the brunt of German fascism and Japanese militarism, suffered the largest losses in World War II, and our leaders agreed to celebrate the upcoming anniversaries with dignity. This is the 80th anniversary of victory in World War II, the Great Patriotic War and World War II in Europe on May 9th this year, and on the 3rd of September, the 80th anniversary of the victory in the Second World War in the Far East.
80-летие победы во Второй мировой войне на Дальнем Востоке.
I am convinced that the information structures and BRICS of other organizations, where we cooperate with China, adequately and widely cover these events. And in the end, of course, we are interested in further strengthening media cooperation within the framework of BRICS. In September, when Russia was chairman, a media summit was held in Moscow, which was organized by the TASS news agency, with the support of the Chinese side. Representatives of the mass media from 45 countries were there, and in October the round table you mentioned. The dialogue of the BRICS mass media took place at Kazan University. I am sure that such events should be regular, held more often. This really creates alternative platforms for access to information for the population of the Global South, the Global East, and interested citizens of Western countries. And there are more and more of them who would like to know the truth about what is happening outside the contour of the European Union and NATO.
Please, we give the floor to our colleagues from the United Arab Emirates and Shark News. Hello, Sergey Viktorovich and Maria Vladimirovna. I will have two questions. The first in Ukraine, the second in Syria. Sergey Viktorovich, Moscow constantly claims that it is ready for negotiations. You confirmed this again just a couple of minutes ago, but Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin said at a press conference that Moscow is ready to negotiate with legitimate authorities, which Zelensky is not. With whom then to negotiate, and how does Moscow see the outcome of its own? And the second question, Moscow also claims that it is negotiating with the new forces that control the government in Syria. How can we characterize these negotiations? And how do you see the future relations between Moscow and Damascus? Thank you very much.
But regarding the legitimacy of the current Ukrainian government, the so-called president said very clearly on a straight line that Ukrainians should deal with this themselves in order to bring the state of affairs in Kyiv in accordance with the Ukrainian constitution. And for this, of course, it is necessary, if they want their president to be legitimate, it is necessary to hold elections. In the meantime, according to the constitution, as Putin explained, only the Verkhovna Rada and its chairman, respectively, have legitimacy. But it's premature to talk about it, in my opinion. The most important thing is not to pick up some kind of negotiating team of the Kyiv regime, but to deal with the root causes of this crisis, which we want to eliminate, and without which there can be no agreement. I have dwelt in detail on these root causes, and I very much hope that all those who are interested in advancing the negotiations understand what is being discussed. I repeat this again, these are not prerequisites. This is what all participants in this process, this conflict, needed to fulfill long ago, in accordance with the obligations already assumed, including in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, the principles of which should be applied in their entirety and interrelationship. Therefore, with this understanding, we are open to any serious proposals. I really hope that everyone understands that a temporary suspension of the fire in order to resume the conflict after some time is unacceptable. We insist on the need for the final conclusion of this conflict on a stable, legally flawless basis, by eliminating its root causes. I very much hope that the understanding of the lack of alternatives to this approach will be strengthened. As for Syria, we have not recalled our diplomats from Damascus. Our embassy continues to work there. Like many other embassies, we maintain contacts with the new Syrian authorities through our diplomatic representation. First of all, we are currently discussing practical issues related to ensuring the safety of Russian citizens and the safe functioning of our embassy, and in general, we are interested and ready for dialogue on other issues of our bilateral relations and on the regional agenda. As President Putin stressed, we are open to contacts with all active socio-political forces in Syria. We maintain these contacts, and we have been maintaining them for quite a long time, even before the recent events. We had such contacts with most of them. And I note that the head of the new authorities in Syria, Akhmet Shara, spoke recently, in my opinion, gave an interview to the BBC where he called the relations between our countries long-standing and strategic. We share this approach. We really have a lot in common with our Syrian friends. We have also made a great contribution to the liberation of Syria from colonial dependence. We have contributed to the training of personnel. Tens of thousands of Syrians have been educated here. 5,000 Syrian citizens are currently studying. And we will be ready to develop such cooperation. I hope that on issues of economic and investment cooperation, where we have certain achievements of the past years, we will be able to resume work with new leaders when the new power structure is finally established. It is clear that this process is not easy. This is a transitional period, which, as it was announced, is preparation for the elections. The basics of the election campaign have to be agreed. All leading countries emphasize that it is necessary to do this in such a way that the process is inclusive, so that all political and ethno-confessional groups of the Syrian people can participate in it in the election campaign and in the elections themselves. It is not an easy process, I repeat once again, but we are ready to contribute to this process, including within the framework of the Security Council, within the framework of the Astana format, where Russia, together with Turkey and Iran, and with the participation of a number of Arab countries, is ready to play the role of supporting the consolidation of all processes in Syria, and organizing elections in such a way that they are recognized by everyone, did not raise any questions. Therefore, we have contacts on this topic with Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt, of course, Qatar, the Emirates, Bahrain, Lebanon. All of them are interested in ensuring that Syria does not repeat the path taken by the Libyan. The Libyan state went after NATO, simply destroyed this state, which still has to be assembled in parts. And so far it has not been very successful. Let's see. Of course, it is very important what role Syria's neighbors will play. We have heard President Erdogan's statement, and we understand the legitimate concerns of the Turkish leadership and the Turkish people about security on the border with Syria, where there have been numerous incidents related to terrorist structures that have staged riots there. These legitimate security interests must be secured, but they must be secured in such a way that Syria retains its sovereignty, territorial integrity, unity, and the Turkish leadership speaks in favor of this, and we support it. It is very important to deal with the east of Syria, where the Americans illegally occupied a significant part of the territory, and the territories where the main oil fields are located, the most fertile lands. All of this is being processed, exported, and the money is being spent on supporting separatist structures that the Americans have created in the east of the Syrian state. All of this needs to be taken into account. Syria cannot be allowed to fall apart. Some would like that. And, of course, it is very important that Israel understands its responsibility for these common efforts, and that it does not try to ensure its own security at the expense of the security of others. This is a principle that was proclaimed quite a long time ago, the principle of indivisibility of security. It is impossible to count on the fact that I will destroy all the military facilities of my neighbor, and then I will live in peace and goodness until the end of time. This is called sowing a storm that will surely return to those who do it.
Please, Telesur Venezuela TV company.
Hello, Sergey Viktorovich. Maria Vladimirovna, I represent the International Latin American Television Project Telesur. These are Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. And we have the first next question. Latin America and Russia have long been united by ties of great historical, cultural, and human sympathies. What concrete steps will Russia take in the coming year, and in general in the future, to strengthen our ties? And what are the priorities of Russian policy in the Latin American region? This is the first question. And secondly, with the Trump administration coming to power in the United States, Russia hopes to build a more pragmatic relationship with it. At the same time, many representatives of the new American administration are known to threaten many of Russia's friends and allies among the countries of the Global South. How could this affect relations between Russia and the United States? Thank you very much. You are absolutely right. Relations between Russia and the countries of Latin America, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Caribbean, are traditionally friendly. Russians and Latin Americans have long-standing mutual sympathies. Mutual respect is also manifested in the sphere of attitude to world culture and each other's culture. It really binds our peoples very firmly. We are now receiving signals from the overwhelming majority of Latin American countries that they are interested in strengthening and expanding partnership with the Russian Federation. We are actively developing a dialogue and cooperation on political issues through diplomatic channels on the economy. Cultural and humanitarian cooperation and interaction between the regions of our countries and even municipalities is developing rapidly. This is an extensive structure of interaction, and we are ready to deepen them as much as possible, to develop them to the extent that the Latin American countries themselves are interested in. We are based on the relationship of equality, mutual benefit, mutual respect. There is no ideology, there are no doctrines. Whether it is the Monroe Doctrine or some other, Although, of course, we pay attention when the Biden administration has stated several times through official representatives over the last 4 years of its rule that it is concerned that Russia has sent a delegation to Nicaragua or sent a delegation to Venezuela, and that this poses risks to the security of the United States. But you have to have a conscience. Everyone understands perfectly well what risks the United States poses to the security of other countries. Having military bases of more than 200, I don't remember in how many countries, but at the same time, it is forbidden to prohibit someone from having relations with the Russian Federation. This is a completely unpromising approach, and I hope that the new administration in Washington will realize this. We have good plans for next year. A number of mutual visits are planned. And we are developing our relations not only through bilateral lines, but also with regional structures such as CILAC, ALBA, the Central American Integration System, Mercosur, CORIC, and many others.
Американская интеграционная система, Меркосур, CARICOM и многие другие.
Therefore, we proceed from the fact that the year will be very fruitful for the event, especially considering that in the coming months, we will literally have a parade of anniversaries of the establishment of diplomatic relations between our country and Latin American states. In March with Venezuela and the Dominican Republic, in April with Guatemala, in June with Ecuador and Colombia, in September with Cuba and Honduras, and in October with Argentina, and in December with Mexico. And, of course, each of these anniversaries will be marked in a worthy way. We also plan exhibitions, conferences, meetings of public figures, youth, cultural events. Of course, this will allow us to outline new prospects for our relations. This year, we are opening a full-fledged embassy in the Dominican Republic. In June, we will be glad to see Latin American guests at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. There is traditionally a Latin American section there. This year, in June, the President of Bolivia, Mr. Ars, was the main guest at the annual forum in St. Petersburg. This is the first time a representative of the Latin American region has participated in this capacity, but I will also draw attention to other forums that are taking place in Russia, and which, of course, will be of interest to our Latin American friends. These are the Eastern Economic Forum, the Russian Energy Week, the St. Petersburg International Cultural Forum, and much more. Despite the past pandemic of the coronavirus, despite the sanctions war unleashed with the West, trade with Latin America is stable, and has remained stable in recent years. Our main trading partners, Brazil, Mexico, Ecuador, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, would be interested in expanding our trade and investment ties with Nicaragua, Venezuela, which, of course, are most seriously affected by the illegal sanctions imposed by the United States. We are implementing bilateral projects with a number of states in various fields, including high-tech, and we are interested in the countries of the continent strengthening their contacts with the Eurasian Economic Commission and the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, the only non-regional observer in the Eurasian Economic Union is the Latin American country Cuba. And, of course, I mentioned cooperation in the educational, humanitarian, cultural, and sports spheres. We are interested in developing all this at the fastest pace. Today, we have almost 5,000 Latin American students studying at the expense of Russian state scholarships. We know that in some Latin American countries, competitions are held to receive such a scholarship, and there are up to 10 people for one scholarship. We are pleased with this, and, of course, we will increase the annual quotas. I would also like to mention among the unique features of our cooperation.
Уникальных черт нашего сотрудничества
27 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean countries, 27 and 33, have an agreement with Russia on visa-free travel of our citizens.
визовых поездках наших граждан.
This is a record in percentage terms. This is a record compared to others, with other parts of the world.
Частями мира.
Russian tourists without visas also visit Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Venezuela, attractions in Peru, Mexico, Guatemala, the Brazilian Carnival, football in Latin America.
Бразильский карнавал, футбол, Латинской Америки.
All this really attracts tourists and provides an increase in tourist flow.
Турпотока.
Next year, we will have a new opportunity to make joint efforts to develop multilateral cooperation. We are holding the International Intervision Song Contest in September of the 25th year, for which more than 25 countries have already expressed their interest, including a number of Latin American countries.
Выразили свою заинтересованность более 25 стран, в том числе ряд стран Латинской Америки.
And for our part, we are ready to welcome and visit tourists from Latin American countries in every possible way to show Moscow, St. Petersburg, Baikal, Kamchatka, Sochi, Suzdal, Altai. We have a lot of picturesque places and historical monuments. Yes, and there is still such a type of tourism as a ride along the Trans-Siberian Railway through the whole of Russia to the Pacific Ocean, and see it with one common look. As for the actions of the United States administration, which is now formalizing its personal composition, which will take office on January 20th, we never have illusions, we never have hopes.
Свой состав персональный, который 20 января вступит уже в полномочия, мы никогда не питаем иллюзий, никогда не питаем надежд.
And it will probably be better to talk about the fact that such and such a president will come in this matter, and if another one, then we will try to do something else somewhere. We will not guess. We will wait for the policy of the new administration to be finally formulated. We have a full understanding that there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States regarding Russia. This consensus is unfriendly and frankly Russophobic, and regardless of party affiliation. The ruling elite will promote its line to ensure that Russia, as a competitor, is weakened in every possible way. I have already touched on this issue at the beginning of our press conference. Any competitor, be it Russia, China, and Europe, the United States is trying to weaken in every possible way. They have long proclaimed the principle that no country in the world should be stronger than the United States. It is clear that life, of course, is tougher than any statements and declarations, but, in order to realize the inevitability of behaving differently, the United States still has a long way to go. And see how the situation really develops, and feel for itself what the realities of a multipolar world are. In the meantime, in Russia, doctrinal documents in the United States are recorded as an enemy. In speeches, representatives of the current administration called it an enemy. It is also designated as an immediate existential threat. China is the next challenge. Therefore, in the United States, the sequence is preserved. But, nevertheless, we, of course, hear signals coming from the Trump team that they are interested in resuming dialogue. And this is absolutely reasonable and normal. Always, even when there are hostile relations between countries, to maintain a dialogue. To see who wants to convey what to the interlocutor, but this is the meaning of diplomacy. Diplomats communicate even during wars, so are there any signals coming from the new team in Washington about resuming? Restoring the dialogue interrupted by Washington after the start of a special military operation, if they are serious, of course. We will respond to them.
После начала специальной военной операции «Диалог», если они серьезны, конечно, мы на них откликнемся.
But the Americans interrupted the dialogue, so they should take the first step. Once again, we are waiting for the official formulation of the Trump administration's policy towards Russia. If Washington takes into account our legitimate interests, then the dialogue, of course, will not be useless, but will be productive. And if our interests are not taken into account, then everything will remain as it is. As for the threats you mentioned by the representatives of the new administration to the global South and East, threats to raise tariffs, threats to punish those who will use some other currencies, other payment platforms, not the dollar, this does not surprise us.
Использовать не доллар, а какие-то другие валюты, другие платежные платформы. Нас это не удивляет.
As I have already said, the suppression of any competitors and the extraction of unilateral benefits have always distinguished the policy of the United States. And there is nothing new in this. The line of interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states has long reflected Washington's methods for a long time. So of course they will continue, and we must be prepared for this. But I will say it again, after all, life must force the United States to understand the trends and real processes of the modern world, and also to understand that dictate can no longer be the main tool for the functioning of international relations.
And we move on to Elsie. This is the TV company TF1. We will hear Gerard Garreau in translation, but we will not see him. Please give you the floor. I have two questions. The first question. Yesterday, on December 25th, about dozens of missiles were directed towards Ukraine, and it happened during Christmas. Don't you think it was a shocking event? And the second question. In December, they were given Macron arranged a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Zelensky in Paris. Don't you think that the president in America can support Kyiv more than he said during his campaign? What do you think about this initiative?
But as for the ongoing hostilities within the framework of our special military operation, or rather within the framework of the war, that the West, including France, has declared by the Russian Federation, and this war is being waged by the hands of the Ukrainian regime, I hope that you, as a representative of the journalistic profession, have not only paid attention to what is happening in connection with the actions of the armed forces on the 25th of December, but also follow the history of the issue, accompany all these processes, analyze and understand the epistemology of the problem, and in which direction this problem is developing. I don't even want to talk much about this topic, because we have repeatedly expressed our rejection of the supply of long-range Western-made missiles, including French scalps, including American attacks, British Storm Sheds, the supply of these long-range missiles to the Kyiv regime, warned that the transfer of deadly weapons would only lead to an escalation, that the Kyiv regime we are not able to comply with the rules of warfare, to comply with international humanitarian rights. If you follow, say, the information that may be muted in Europe, but it is available daily on television, in social networks, on the internet.
Скажем, той информации, которую в Европе, может быть, приглушают, но у нас она доступна ежедневно и по телевидению, и в соцсетях, в интернете.
Daily strikes by drones or your Western missiles on frankly civilian targets. Civilians are being killed, ambulances, schools, hospitals, commodity markets, and other, as I have already said. Civilian objects are being hit. No one from the Western states supplying weapons to the Nazi regime in Kyiv. has ever warned him against engaging in such a gross violation of international humanitarian law and the rules of warfare. As long as this behavior of the Kyiv regime continues, and it is not just encouraged, but directed with the West, including France, we will respond, but we will not respond in the way that the Kyiv regime does at your instigation.
Это делает киевский режим по вашему, так сказать, наущению.
We aim exclusively at military facilities, military-industrial complex facilities, and other facilities that are related to the provision of the armed forces of Ukraine. On the 20th of December, when the missiles attacked civilian targets in the Russian Federation from the sides of the Shedu, we responded with precision weapons to, I list the targets, the control points of the Security Service of Ukraine forces. At the Kyiv Design Bureau Luch, which designs and manufactures Neptune missile systems and cruise missiles, and multiple launch rocket systems, as well as the positions of the American the Patriot air defense system. All targets are hit. We are hitting those points firm which the shelling is being conducted. Our territories and civilian objects are being shelled, and civilians are being killed from them. I would like to emphasize once again what the President said. We select targets for destruction on the territory of Ukraine, based solely on the threats of the Russian Federation. These may also be military facilities, defense industry enterprises, decision-making centers in Kyiv may well be such targets as well. But responding to civilian targets is not in our rules. This is the rule of the Nazis, who settled in Kyiv with the support of the West, and the rules of those who supply them with weapons, for the destruction of purely civilian infrastructure and civilians. As for your second question, we are already used to a large number of initiatives that France announces, holds various meetings and conferences. Here I remember, back in December 2015 year, President Talent suddenly unexpectedly announced that it was necessary to urgently convene a conference on Libya. We gathered for this conference, made speeches for a day and a half, and then forgot about everything. But the conference itself was very beautifully shown on French television. Our French colleagues have such a desire to play an initiative role on a variety of issues. And we welcome this, but I do not know what the result of such initiatives is, and to what extent the desire to play a positive role is sincere. I won't go into details so as not to let anyone down, but several times there were appeals from our French colleagues through closed channels. Let's help. We will establish a dialogue on the Ukrainian issue. By the way, without any Ukraine, just a dialogue on the Ukrainian issue, as if in violation of the principle that the West constantly repeats that not a word about Ukraine without Ukraine. We do not refuse contacts. We are ready to listen. But in parallel with this, France is the main initiator of sending so-called peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, preparing combat units of the armed forces of Ukraine on its territory, directly stating that it is necessary to continue hammering Russia and ensure that Ukraine prepares for negotiations from a stronger position.
Долбить Россию и добиться того, чтобы Украина подготовилась к переговорам с более сильных позиций.
Such ambiguous behavior does not cause a desire to take seriously what is happening on the initiative of our French colleagues.
Всерьез относиться к тому, что происходит по инициативе наших французских коллег.
And regarding the meeting that took place in connection with the opening ceremony of Notre-Dame de Paris, I did not see any encouraging signals in the picture. I still have the feeling that, first of all, the most important thing in this meeting was the picture when three politicians, two politicians, and one Nazi racist. We were photographed against the background of this cathedral.
Два политика и один расист нацистского толка сфотографировались на фоне этого собора.
Concluding the topic that the French journalist raised, I would like to draw his attention to the fact that exactly 2 weeks ago, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said on his page in social networks that Zelensky refused the Christmas truce. And we move on to the final question. Please, colleagues, Russia Today.
Thank you, Maria Vladimirovna. Dear Sergey Viktorovich, Happy New Year to you. I have two questions. NATO representatives Patrick Turner, speaking about plans for 2025 year, announced the settlement of the alliance's presence in Ukraine. This year, he said, there are 3 NATO presence here, and we plan to further strengthen it next year. Sergey Viktorovich, how would you comment on NATO's plans to expand its presence in Ukraine? And should we expect an official reaction from Moscow to this expansion? And the second question. I also want to continue the topic of the series. What is the future of negotiations within the framework of the Astana format? Especially considering that this format has demonstrated high efficiency in coordination with its Syrian countries. But as for the presence of NATO, but first of all, of course, NATO is primarily the United States. And the special services of the United States and the CIA and others were present in Ukraine, even long before the coup. And after the coup, they just settled there in the security service of Ukraine. They had a whole floor, and maybe even 2. Therefore, it is not the independence of the Kyiv regime that came to power as a result of the coup. It is well known, and no one, in fact, doubts it. It is led primarily by the Anglo-Saxons and some other countries of the North Atlantic Alliance, the European Union. As for the message you mentioned, there was probably recently, in accordance with the Washington decision of the Washington Summit in July, the office of the senior representative of NATO in Ukraine was created. This position was introduced by the decision of the Washington Summit. According to our data, about 50 people are currently working in this mission, and another 20 should appear next year. Perhaps this is what was discussed in the information you mentioned. But this is superfluous. It is not such a significant event, but nevertheless, an additional fact that confirms that Washington and its allies are taking Ukraine into their hands, establishing tight control, or rather even compacting the already established control over all spheres of life of this state, including the security sector, the defense sector. The West strongly advises Zelensky to act in a way that is beneficial to the West. Look at how openly, unceremoniously they demanded to lower the draft age to 18, without hiding, that this is primarily in the interests of the United States. Remember, there was such a senator, Lindsey Graham, who, after visiting Ukraine, taking a beautiful picture with Zelensky, stated directly that there was a huge amount of wealth in Ukraine, first of all rare earth minerals. And it is impossible to give Russia this breadbasket of the world, the richest in Europe for rare earth metals. And Secretary of State Blinken is known for publicly defending the need for a war in Ukraine, as he put it, with financial and economic benefits for the United States. And the fact that many fertile lands and deposits of mineral resources of Ukraine have been acquired by American corporations for a long time. This is also a little secret. So everything that we set out with regard to the Ukrainian crisis, everything that the President outlined, as the principles of its settlement based on the elimination of the root causes, and elimination based solely on international rights and the already existing obligations of the West and Ukraine. All this remains fully as our uncontested position. As for Syria and the role of the Astana format, I have already touched on this topic. The Astana format was created following a special nationwide conference of Syrian political and ethno-confessional forces. We have already met more than 20 times within the framework of the Astana format. The last meeting was on the 7th of December in a breath, right on the eve of the Syrian events. We had the opportunity to discuss the situation with my colleagues from Turkey, Iran, and with the involvement of special representatives of Secretary General Geir Pedersen. And we are all still exchanging assessments, of course, opinions. And the position of Turkey, Iran, and Russia is that the Astana format may well play a useful role at the current stage. Moreover, Arab states have traditionally participated in its work as observers, including Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and the monarchies of the Persian Gulf are also showing interest. Therefore, we have indicated our willingness to help. The same thing was done by the Fools and the Iranians. The Arab countries that are now in contact with the new authorities in Damascus are aware of our capabilities. And given what Akhmet Shara said about our relations, calling them long-standing and strategic, I think the new Syrian authorities will be able to determine in what specific form, in what forms the Astana format can assist the processes that have now begun in Syria. I say again, we have close ties with the Syrian people since the Soviet Union, when our country actively supported the Syrians' desire to get rid of French colonialism, and all subsequent years. We have contributed to the creation of the foundations of the economy, industry, and social sphere of the Syrian Arab Republic. It is clear that the interest of the Syrian people is to establish good relations with all external players without exception. We think this is absolutely correct. This is one of the main factors that will guarantee the unity, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of the Syrian state. We are ready to contribute to this in every possible way. But it is clear that Akhmet Shara, his ally, is now under enormous pressure from the West. The Americans have become more active, the Europeans. And everyone wants to work not to preserve the unity of all ethno-political forces in Syria, but to tear themselves away from more influence and even territory. And as for the selfishness of the West, the new head of EU diplomacy, Kaja Kallas, spoke very pointedly, demanding that Syria stop cooperating with Russia and such an important power as Estonia, through the mouth of its foreign minister. I don't remember the name, unfortunately, said that Estonia would not support the new authorities in Damascus if they will not expel Russian military bases from Syria. Can you imagine how scary it is? Therefore, it is already diplomatic rudeness, it becomes habitual. This is how the Ukrainian authorities act, insulting everyone who does not sing along with them in chorus. And so do our Euro-European neighbors. I hope that their life will also teach them to respect the interests of all states without exception, and to abandon neocolonial habits. Therefore, we will continue to work.
Dear colleagues, thank you for your participation. This concludes the interview with Sergeyevich Lavrov. Thank you.
Thank you.